There exists a particular and extraordinary paradox at the heart of human civilization, a paradox that emerges when societies systematically create institutions designed to separate individuals from their money through mechanisms that exploit fundamental psychological vulnerabilities, that disguise mathematical certainties as games of chance, and that have evolved across millennia from simple games played in marketplaces to extraordinarily sophisticated technological and architectural systems designed with the explicit purpose of maximizing the extraction of wealth from populations that can least afford to lose it. This is the story of gambling and of casinos, of how human desire for the possibility of sudden wealth combined with the mathematical certainty that the house always wins has created an industry that generates hundreds of billions of dollars annually in revenue while destroying the lives of millions of individuals who fall into addiction. The narrative spans from ancient China, where games of chance were played thousands of years ago, through contemporary digital platforms where algorithmic systems are designed to manipulate human behavior with precision that would seem impossible just decades ago. What emerges from examining this history is not a story of entertainment or of harmless recreation, but rather a story of systematic exploitation, of regulatory capture, of the creation and perpetuation of addiction on scales comparable to the pharmaceutical and drug epidemics that have devastated populations worldwide. The history of gambling extends back further than most people realize, into periods of human civilization when the desire to transform small amounts of resources into larger amounts through games of chance was already deeply embedded in human psychology and in social practice. In ancient China, gambling was widespread and organized, with games involving dice and cards existing as early as the 9th century. The games were not casual diversions. They were serious activities that involved substantial stakes, that consumed the time and resources of participants, and that sometimes resulted in financial ruin. Chinese emperors recognized the potential for social disruption caused by gambling and periodically attempted to restrict or regulate the activity, though these restrictions were generally ineffective as demand for gambling remained constant and prohibition simply drove the activity underground. In ancient Rome, gambling was similarly widespread despite being periodically forbidden by various authorities. Roman soldiers gambled on virtually anything. Dice games were ubiquitous in military encampments, and the games frequently consumed soldiers' wages and equipment. The combination of human psychology, the attraction to the possibility of sudden wealth, and the mathematical reality that games of chance could be structured to benefit a particular party meant that organized gambling, whether in the form of informal games among soldiers or more formal establishments, consistently generated wealth for those who controlled the games and consistently resulted in losses for those who participated. What distinguishes gambling from other forms of economic transaction is that gambling is fundamentally dishonest at its core, even when it is completely legal and completely transparent about its mechanisms. In a normal market transaction, both parties presumably benefit. A person exchanges money for a good or service that they value more than the money, and the seller values the money more than the good or service. The transaction is voluntary, and both parties believe they are better off afterward. But in gambling, the mathematics are different. The person gambling pays money to participate in a game structured so that they will, on average, lose money. The expected value of gambling is negative for the person gambling. This is not hidden. Casinos openly acknowledge that the house has an advantage, that the odds favor the establishment. Yet people gamble anyway, motivated by the possibility, however remote, of winning large amounts of money, or by the experience of gambling itself, or by the psychological state that gambling induces. This fundamental structure, where participation is mathematically guaranteed to result in losses on average, where the odds are deliberately structured to favor the operator, where the operator has superior knowledge about how the games actually work, creates a situation that can only be described as systematic extraction of wealth from populations. The evolution of gambling from informal games played in streets and marketplaces to formal institutions designed specifically for the purpose of extracting wealth occurred gradually, and reflected the increasing sophistication of both the mathematics of probability and the understanding of human psychology. In medieval Europe, gambling was widespread and was eventually recognized by authorities as a problem significant enough to warrant regulation. Some cities established official gaming houses where gambling was permitted under license, partly to generate tax revenue and partly to concentrate gambling in specific locations where it could be monitored and regulated. This model of licensed gambling establishments would eventually become the basis for the modern casino. What was not understood initially but would eventually become clear was that licensing gambling and permitting it to operate under government oversight did not eliminate the harms associated with gambling. It legitimized those harms and allowed them to be systematized and scaled. The first casino in the modern sense is generally considered to be the Casino of Venice, established in Italy in the 17th century. Venice in this period was an extraordinarily wealthy merchant republic, and the city was filled with people with money seeking entertainment and diversion. The establishment of a formal casino, a dedicated building where gambling games were offered under official regulation, represented a logical response to demand. The casino was successful financially and generated substantial revenue for both the proprietors and for the Venetian government through taxation. The success of the Venice casino sparked imitation. Other Italian cities established casinos, and the model spread to other European regions. By the 18th and 19th centuries, casinos had become established features of European cities, particularly in resort areas that attracted wealthy travelers. The casino had transformed from an informal gathering where games were played to a formal institution with architectural design specifically intended to create an environment conducive to gambling, with the physics and psychology of the space deliberately engineered to keep people gambling longer and to encourage them to gamble more money. The design innovations that European casinos pioneered in the 18th and 19th centuries established patterns that would persist and would be elaborated on through the 20th and 21st centuries. The interior layout of casinos was designed to be confusing, to lack obvious exits, to have winding pathways between gaming areas, to create a sense that the space was larger and more complex than it actually was. This design served a psychological purpose. People who are uncertain about where they are and how to get out of a space are more likely to stay in that space and to continue engaging in whatever activity is available there. The lighting in casinos was designed to be artificial and consistent throughout the day and night, eliminating any natural cues about time. This served the purpose of disorienting people about how long they had been gambling and of removing temporal boundaries that might encourage them to leave. The sounds in casinos were designed to be stimulating and engaging. The sounds of coins falling from slot machines, the sounds of excitement from winners, the ambient music and noise that created constant stimulation without being loud enough to be unpleasant. All of these design elements served a single purpose: to maximize the time that people spent gambling and to maximize the amount of money that people wagered during that time. None of these design elements were accidental. They were the result of deliberate choices made by architects and by casino owners who understood that the more time a person spent gambling, the more money they were statistically likely to lose. The mathematical advantage of the house meant that every additional minute a person gambled was, on average, another minute during which they were losing money. This fundamental insight, that the purpose of casino design is to maximize gambling time, would become increasingly sophisticated as casino design and casino psychology evolved. The mathematical foundation of casino gambling is extraordinarily simple once understood. Yet this simplicity is deliberately obscured through the presentation of gambling as games rather than as mathematical extractions of wealth. In any casino game, the odds are deliberately structured so that the expected value of a bet is negative for the person placing the bet. For example, in roulette, a wheel has 38 possible outcomes in American roulette. If a person bets on a single number, they have a 1 in 38 chance of winning. If they win, they receive a payout of 35 to 1, meaning they get their original bet back plus 35 times the amount they bet. But the correct odds should be 37 to 1 because there are 37 other possible outcomes. The fact that the payout is 35 to 1 instead of 37 to 1 means that the person betting is being paid slightly less than the true odds. Over many bets, this small discrepancy compounds into a mathematical certainty that the person will lose money on average. The casino keeps the difference, the 2 to 1 advantage. This advantage is called the house edge, and it exists in every casino game. In blackjack, the house edge is typically around 1% if the person plays with optimal strategy. In roulette, the house edge is about 2.7% for European roulette and 5.26% for American roulette. In slot machines, the house edge can be anywhere from 2% to 15% or higher. The house edge is not a flaw in the game, it is the entire point of the game. It is the mechanism through which casinos extract money from people. From the casino's perspective, every person who gambles is, on average, transferring money to the casino at a rate determined by the house edge. A person betting $100 on a game with a 5% house edge will lose an average of $5. Over $1,000 of bets, they will lose an average of $50. Over $10,000, they will lose an average of $500. The mathematics are absolute and inexorable. The only way to not lose money on average is to not gamble. Yet people do gamble, in the full knowledge that the odds are against them, in the full understanding that they are statistically likely to lose money. The question of why people engage in an activity that they know will result in financial loss on average is a question that combines psychology, economics, and neurobiology. Part of the answer involves the possibility, however remote, of winning large amounts of money. Another part involves the psychological state that gambling induces, the arousal, the excitement, the sense that something significant is at stake. Another part involves the social aspects of gambling, the interaction with other people, the collective experience of risking and winning and losing. And another part, increasingly significant in contemporary casinos and online gambling platforms, involves the deliberate manipulation of human psychology through the design of games and through the application of neuroscience to create and perpetuate addiction. The transformation of gambling from a widespread but informal activity into a systematically organized and deliberately designed industry designed to extract wealth from populations occurred gradually through the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, and then explosively in 20th century America. The American context for the development of modern casino gambling was fundamentally different from the European context. While European casinos existed as established institutions in resort cities and were subject to government regulation, American attitudes toward gambling were shaped by a different cultural and legal framework. The United States was founded as a nation that was skeptical of centralized government authority and that was oriented toward individual liberty and market economics. Yet the United States also developed strong moral and religious traditions that viewed gambling as sinful and morally corrupting. This contradiction between the cultural orientation toward market freedom and the moral opposition to gambling created an unstable situation in which gambling was sometimes permitted and sometimes prohibited, sometimes regulated and sometimes banned entirely, depending on the jurisdiction and the historical moment. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, most states gradually prohibited or severely restricted gambling as moral reformers gained political influence and as social movements against gambling gained traction. Nevada, the state that would eventually become synonymous with gambling in America, initially followed the same trajectory. Gambling was prohibited through most of the 19th century. But Nevada in the 1930s faced severe economic depression as a result of the collapse of the mining industry that had driven the state's economy. The state government, desperate for revenue, took the unprecedented step of legalizing gambling statewide in 1931. This decision would transform Nevada and would eventually transform the entire American relationship with gambling. But the immediate result was that gambling remained marginal to the Nevada economy, and that most casinos in Nevada were small, informal establishments with minimal amenities and minimal sophistication in design or game design. The transformation of Nevada gambling from a marginal activity into the foundation for an entirely new model of resort development occurred in the 1940s through the vision and the criminal activity of a single individual, Bugsy Siegel. Siegel was a mobster, a member of organized crime syndicates that controlled much of the illicit economy in America. Organized crime had made fortunes through prohibition of alcohol, through drug trafficking, through extortion and racketeering. As prohibition ended, and as the immediate profits from alcohol trafficking diminished, organized crime sought new sources of revenue. Siegel recognized that Nevada's legalization of gambling presented an opportunity to establish a legitimate-appearing business that could serve as a mechanism for laundering illegal money while simultaneously generating enormous profits from the gambling operations themselves. In 1946, Siegel opened the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. The Flamingo was unlike anything that had previously existed in Nevada. It was an extraordinarily luxurious resort with fine dining, entertainment, and gambling facilities. The hotel was designed to appeal to wealthy visitors and to create an experience that was about far more than just gambling. The casino was an elegant facility with careful attention to design and to the psychological elements that would encourage gambling. The surrounding resort facilities, the restaurants, the bars, the entertainment venues, were designed to keep visitors on the property and to encourage them to spend money. The entire complex was designed as an integrated system where every element supported the central purpose of extracting money from visitors through gambling and through the sale of food, beverages, and entertainment. The Flamingo was financed partly through legitimate investment, but significantly through money laundered from organized crime operations. The construction costs vastly exceeded the initial budget. The project went from an estimated $1 million to over $6 million, with much of the excess going to organized crime figures who had financial interests in the project. Once the Flamingo opened, it was extraordinarily profitable. Visitors came to experience the luxury, the entertainment, and the gambling. They spent money at unprecedented rates. Within a few years, the Flamingo had become a hugely successful enterprise, and other organized crime figures recognized the opportunity and began building their own casino resorts on what became known as the Las Vegas Strip. The organizational model that emerged in Las Vegas during the 1950s and 1960s was fundamentally different from the European casino model. Rather than being isolated resort facilities in established cities, Las Vegas casinos were concentrated in a specific geographic area and were explicitly designed as destination resorts that would attract visitors from across the United States and eventually from around the world. The casinos competed with each other for visitors and for the money those visitors would gamble. This competition drove innovation in design, in amenities, in entertainment, and in the sophistication of the gambling operations themselves. Each new casino tried to be more luxurious, more entertaining, and more effective at extracting money from visitors than the casinos that had come before. The role of organized crime in establishing and operating Las Vegas casinos is crucial to understanding the history of American gambling. The criminal organizations that controlled Las Vegas casinos were not fundamentally interested in gambling for its own sake. They were interested in the money that could be extracted from gambling. The mobsters understood that casinos could serve multiple purposes. They could generate enormous direct profits from the gambling operations, they could launder money from other criminal enterprises, and they could serve as sources of political influence and as ways to accumulate wealth that could eventually be invested in legitimate businesses. The organized crime control of Las Vegas meant that the casinos operated with minimal regulatory oversight and with a fundamental understanding that the purpose of the casino was to extract as much money as possible from visitors. The methods used by Las Vegas casinos to extract money from visitors during this period included not just the mathematical advantage of the games themselves, but also active fraud and manipulation. Casinos employed techniques to cheat at games when they felt they could do so without being caught. Casinos employed dealers and other staff who were instructed in subtle techniques for influencing the outcomes of games. Casinos manipulated the odds of games beyond what was officially acknowledged. And casinos employed psychological manipulation to encourage visitors to gamble longer and to bet more money. These techniques were not unique to Las Vegas or to organized crime. Similar techniques had been employed in casinos throughout history, but the scale at which they were employed in Las Vegas and the sophistication with which they were applied represented a new level of systematic extraction of wealth from visitors. By the 1960s, organized crime control of Las Vegas was becoming a problem for the government. Federal authorities were investigating mob involvement in casinos and were threatening prosecutions. The mob, recognizing that their control of Las Vegas was becoming politically difficult to maintain, began a gradual process of transferring ownership of major casinos to legitimate business entities. The most famous example of this transition was the sale of the Flamingo to Kirk Kerkorian, a legitimate businessperson who would go on to build one of the largest casino corporations in America. This transition from mob control to corporate control did not represent a fundamental change in the purpose or the operation of casinos. It represented a change in ownership and in the legal structure through which casinos operated. The purpose remained the same: to extract as much money as possible from visitors. The methods remained largely the same: to use psychological manipulation, sophisticated game design, and architectural design to maximize the time people spent gambling and the amount of money they wagered. The transition from mob control to corporate control of Las Vegas is often presented in popular culture and in mainstream historical narratives as a triumph of legitimate business over organized crime. as the replacement of criminals with respectable business people. But this narrative obscures the fundamental reality. The casinos themselves, regardless of who owned them, were designed with the explicit purpose of extracting wealth from people through exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities, and through games structured so that the participant was mathematically guaranteed to lose money on average. The transition from mob to corporate ownership changed the entities that benefited from this extraction, but it did not change the nature of the extraction itself. The corporate casinos continued to employ the same psychological manipulation, the same game design strategies, and the same architectural innovations that had characterized mob-controlled casinos. They simply did so under a veneer of respectability and with the implicit approval of government and regulatory authorities. The evolution of casino design and casino psychology during the second half of the 20th century reflected the increasing application of neuroscience, psychology, and architectural design to the purpose of maximizing gambling and maximizing the extraction of money from visitors. The casinos that replaced mob-controlled properties in Las Vegas during the 1960s and 1970s were extraordinarily elaborate, incorporating design elements that had been carefully studied and that were known to influence human behavior. The casinos employed architects and designers who understood the psychology of space and who deliberately created environments that would encourage gambling. The use of bright colors, of flashing lights, of artificial stimulation designed to maintain heightened arousal. All of these elements were the result of deliberate choices made by people who understood that these environments would keep people gambling longer and betting more money. The expansion of casino gambling beyond Las Vegas during the 1980s and 1990s represented a crucial moment in the history of American gambling. For decades, Las Vegas had been the primary location where Americans could legally gamble in casinos. The concentration of casino gambling in Las Vegas meant that the industry was geographically limited, and that the number of people who regularly gambled in casinos was constrained by the difficulty of traveling to Las Vegas. But as other states began legalizing casino gambling, first in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1978, and subsequently in other states, casino gambling became geographically dispersed and became accessible to far larger populations. This expansion transformed gambling from a specialized activity, engaged in by people wealthy enough to travel to Las Vegas, into a mainstream activity, accessible to millions of people in their local communities. The expansion of casino gambling was driven not by demand from the public, but by the recognition by state governments that casinos could generate substantial tax revenue. States facing budget pressures recognized that casino gambling could serve as a revenue source that would allow them to avoid raising taxes or cutting services. This created a perverse incentive structure in which state governments had financial incentives to promote gambling, to make gambling as accessible as possible, and to maximize the revenue extracted from gambling. State governments began to actively market casino gambling, to encourage casino construction, and to work with casino corporations to create favorable regulatory and tax environments for casino operations. The result was that casino gambling spread from Las Vegas across the United States, from Atlantic City to Mississippi riverboats to Native American reservations to Native American casinos on tribal lands. This geographic expansion of casino gambling was accompanied by increasing sophistication in the design of games and in the application of psychological principles to encourage gambling and to maximize the amount of money people wagered. Slot machines, which had existed for decades, underwent fundamental redesign during this period. The mechanical slot machines of earlier eras were replaced by electronic machines that could be programmed to have different odds and different payoff structures than what was displayed to the player. The electronic machines could also be programmed to create specific psychological experiences designed to encourage continued gambling. The concept of near-miss events, situations where the slot machine almost resulted in a winning combination but did not, was deliberately engineered into the machines. Research in psychology had demonstrated that near-miss events produced heightened arousal and increased motivation to continue gambling, even though near-miss events had no bearing on the probability of future wins. This application of psychological research to slot machine design represented a crucial moment in the history of gambling. Rather than simply creating games with house advantages and letting psychology operate naturally, casino corporations were now deliberately engineering psychological experiences into the games with the explicit purpose of encouraging continued gambling, and of maximizing the amount of money people wagered. The near-miss mechanisms in slot machines are not accidental. They are deliberately programmed features designed to manipulate players into continuing to gamble even when they are losing money. The machines are designed to give the impression that winning combinations are almost possible, that the player is close to winning, even though the machines are actually programmed to prevent winning combinations a certain percentage of the time. The application of psychological research to casino design extended beyond individual games to the design of entire casinos. The physical layout of casinos was deliberately designed to maximize the amount of time people spent in the casino and to maximize the amount of money they wagered. Casinos deliberately eliminated clocks and windows so that people would lose track of time. Casinos made it difficult to find exits so that people would continue wandering through the casino, encountering different games and attractions. Casinos positioned the most profitable games in high-traffic areas where people would encounter them frequently. Casinos used lighting, sound, and other environmental factors to maintain heightened arousal and to prevent people from becoming tired or bored enough to leave. The role of comps, free or reduced-price amenities like hotel rooms, meals, and entertainment, represented another psychological tool employed by casinos to encourage gambling. Casinos tracked how much money individual customers gambled and offered comps proportional to the amount wagered. The comps served multiple purposes. They encouraged people to gamble more in order to earn more valuable comps. They created a sense of obligation to the casino. The casino gave me a free room, so I should gamble more to show appreciation, and they made the total cost of the gambling experience feel lower than it actually was. A person who gambled away $1,000 but received $200 worth of comps felt that they had only lost $800, even though they had actually wagered and lost $1,000. The marketing of casinos during the expansion period represented another crucial element in the transformation of gambling into a mainstream activity. Casinos began to market themselves not as places to gamble, but as entertainment destinations where people came for the restaurants, the entertainment, the hotels, and the gambling was simply one activity among many. This framing served a crucial psychological purpose. It made gambling seem like a normal and respectable activity rather than something that carried moral stigma. The casinos emphasized the entertainment value and the social aspects of gambling rather than emphasizing the mathematical reality that people were statistically likely to lose money. The marketing created an image of gambling as harmless fun rather than as an activity designed to extract wealth from people through exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities. The corporate structure of modern casino corporations represented a further evolution in the sophistication of gambling as an industry. Large corporations like MGM, Caesars, and Harrah's operated dozens or hundreds of casinos and developed sophisticated methods for maximizing profits across their entire operations. These corporations employed statisticians and mathematicians to design games that would generate maximum profit while remaining legal and while appearing fair to players. They employed psychologists to design casino environments and game structures that would maximize the time people spent gambling and the amount they wagered. They employed marketing specialists to develop advertising and promotional strategies designed to attract people to casinos and to encourage them to gamble. The entire enterprise was designed with scientific precision to extract wealth from people who were statistically guaranteed to lose money if they gambled. The mathematical and psychological mechanisms through which casinos extract money from people deserve deeper examination because they reveal the fundamental deception at the heart of the gambling industry. The house edge, the statistical advantage that the casino has in every game, means that the longer someone gambles, the more money they will lose on average. This is not a matter of luck or of bad decisions by the person gambling. This is a mathematical certainty that applies regardless of how skilled the person is at the particular game. Even in games like blackjack, where strategy matters and where a skilled player can reduce the house edge to around 1%, the expected value of gambling remains negative. The person will lose money on average. Yet casinos thrive precisely because people do not understand or do not accept this mathematical reality. The human mind is extraordinarily susceptible to the gambler's fallacy, the belief that past events influence the probability of future events in a way that they actually do not. A person who has lost 5 times in a row might believe that they are due for a win, even though the probability of winning on the next bet is completely independent of the previous outcomes. The human mind is also susceptible to the illusion of control, the belief that they can influence the outcomes of games that are actually determined by chance. A person throwing dice might believe that they can influence how the dice land, even though there is no mechanism through which their throwing technique would affect the outcome. The casinos deliberately exploit these psychological vulnerabilities. The near-miss mechanisms in slot machines exploit the gambler's fallacy and the illusion of control. They make it appear that winning is almost possible, that the player came close to winning, creating the impression that the player might be able to win on the next try. The design of the casino environment exploits the human tendency to become disoriented in unfamiliar spaces and to lose track of time and money. The provision of alcohol in casinos exploits the fact that alcohol impairs decision-making and judgment, making people more likely to make bets they would not otherwise make and to bet larger amounts than they would otherwise bet. The combination of these psychological manipulations creates a situation where people are far more likely to spend far more money gambling than they would if they were making decisions based on rational assessment of the mathematical odds. The concept of problem gambling, or gambling addiction, emerged during the late 20th century as evidence accumulated that a significant portion of people who gambled developed patterns of behavior that were similar to addiction to drugs or alcohol. Problem gamblers experienced increased tolerance. They needed to gamble with larger amounts of money to achieve the same psychological effects. They experienced withdrawal symptoms when they attempted to stop gambling. They engaged in lying and deception to hide the extent of their gambling. They continued gambling despite serious negative consequences, including financial devastation, loss of relationships, loss of employment, and psychological distress. The recognition that gambling could produce addiction led to the classification of pathological gambling as a psychiatric disorder. The existence of gambling addiction creates an extraordinary moral problem for the gambling industry. The industry is built on the extraction of money from people through games that are mathematically designed to result in losses for the participants. If the industry operated only on the voluntary participation of people who understood the odds, and who accepted the mathematical certainty that they would lose money on average, the moral problem would be significant but would at least be limited to people who were making a conscious choice. But the industry actively works to create and perpetuate addiction, to manipulate people into gambling more than they would otherwise gamble, and to exploit psychological vulnerabilities. This creates a situation where a significant portion of the money that the industry extracts comes not from people making voluntary choices, but from people with gambling addictions who are compulsively gambling despite serious negative consequences. The prevalence of gambling addiction is substantial. Estimates suggest that 1–3% of the population develops gambling addiction at some point in their lives. This means that in the United States, millions of people develop gambling addictions. For each person with a severe gambling addiction, there are multiple people with less severe but still problematic gambling behaviors. The financial and psychological costs of gambling addiction are enormous. Problem gamblers experience financial devastation as they lose their savings and accumulate enormous debts. They experience loss of employment as gambling consumes their time and their mental resources. They experience loss of relationships as lying and deception damage trust. They experience psychological distress, including depression and anxiety, and sometimes suicide. The industry's response to the problem of gambling addiction has been characteristically inadequate. While casinos and state governments acknowledge that gambling addiction exists and is a problem, the resources devoted to treatment and prevention are minuscule compared to the resources devoted to promoting gambling and to making gambling as accessible and as appealing as possible. State governments that derive revenue from gambling have clear financial incentives to promote gambling and to minimize the seriousness of gambling addiction. Casinos have clear financial incentives to encourage people to gamble as much as possible regardless of whether they are developing addiction. This creates a situation where the institutions that could reduce gambling addiction have financial incentives to increase it. The specific mechanisms through which the industry creates and perpetuates addiction deserve attention. The use of variable reward schedules, situations where gambling results in wins some of the time but not others, creates patterns of behavior that are maximally resistant to extinction. This is the same principle that behavioral psychologists have documented in multiple contexts. A rat that receives a food pellet every time it presses a lever will stop pressing the lever relatively quickly if the food stops coming. But a rat that receives a food pellet sometimes but not other times will continue pressing the lever for an extraordinarily long time even after the food stops coming entirely. This principle is why slot machines with variable payoff schedules are so effective at creating continued gambling even in the face of continued losses. The design of modern slot machines and of other electronic gambling games deliberately applies principles of behavioral psychology to create and perpetuate gambling behavior. The machines provide immediate feedback about wins and losses, which prevents the person from accurately assessing their total money won or lost over time. The machines use sounds and lights and animations to celebrate wins and to create excitement around winning combinations, which creates positive associations with the winning-creating behavior. The machines are designed so that wins that do not produce a net profit are still celebrated with sounds and lights, creating the impression that these non-wins are somehow positive events. This entire design structure is explicitly intended to encourage continued gambling and to create patterns of behavior that are resistant to extinction. The regulatory frameworks within which casinos operate have, throughout the history of casino gambling, been inadequate to protect people from harm caused by gambling. The regulation of casinos has been shaped by the financial interests of state governments that derive revenue from gambling and by the lobbying power of casino corporations. In most jurisdictions where casino gambling is legal, the regulation focuses on preventing fraud and money laundering rather than on protecting people from developing gambling addiction or from gambling away more money than they can afford to lose. The regulations typically require that casinos publicly post odds and information about the house edge, creating the impression that the casinos are being transparent about the mathematical advantages they possess. But publicly posting odds does nothing to change the psychological manipulation and architectural design that encourages people to gamble beyond what they would choose to gamble if making rational decisions. The public health response to problem gambling has been similarly inadequate. While some jurisdictions require casinos to fund treatment programs for gambling addiction, the funding is typically minuscule compared to the revenues generated by the casinos. A casino that generates $100 million in annual revenue might be required to contribute $500,000 to gambling addiction treatment, 0.5% of revenue. This creates a situation where the institution that is profiting from creating gambling addiction is also responsible for funding treatment, but with financial resources so limited that the treatment programs cannot meet the needs of all people who need treatment. The result is that the vast majority of people with gambling addiction do not receive treatment and continue gambling despite serious negative consequences. The expansion of casino gambling into online and digital formats during the 2010s and 2020s represented a fundamental transformation in how gambling is offered and in how psychological manipulation is applied. Online gambling removes the geographic and temporal constraints of physical casinos. A person can gamble from their home at any time of day or night. This removes natural barriers to gambling, the need to travel to a casino, the opportunity to stop gambling because the casino is closed, the possibility of bumping into someone who might discourage gambling. Online gambling platforms employ the same psychological manipulation tactics that physical casinos employ, but with even greater precision because the digital format allows for detailed tracking of behavior and for algorithmic adaptation of the experience to maximize gambling for each individual user. The business model of online gambling involves collecting vast amounts of data about individual users' gambling behavior and using that data to customize the experience to maximize the amount each person gambles. The platforms track which games each person plays, how long they play, how much they win and lose, what time of day they gamble, how much time passes between gambling sessions. Using this data, the platforms employ machine learning algorithms to determine what promotional offers, what game variations, what personalized messages would be most likely to encourage each individual user to gamble more. This represents an extraordinarily sophisticated system of psychological manipulation, where the experience is customized at an individual level to exploit each person's particular psychological vulnerabilities and to encourage them to gamble as much as possible. The marketing of online gambling has focused on convenience, on the availability of betting on sports in real time, and on the social aspects of gambling. Online gambling platforms have aggressively marketed themselves to young people, creating the impression that online gambling is a normal and respectable activity rather than an activity that exploits psychological vulnerabilities, and that is mathematically designed to result in the loss of money on average. The marketing has not emphasized the odds or the mathematical certainty that users will lose money on average. Instead, the marketing has emphasized the potential for large wins, the excitement of gambling, and the social aspects of participating in online gambling communities. The regulation of online gambling has lagged behind the rapid expansion of the industry. Many jurisdictions have not established clear regulatory frameworks for online gambling, creating situations where online gambling occurs in legal gray zones. Even in jurisdictions that have established regulatory frameworks, the regulation typically focuses on preventing fraud and on ensuring that users are of legal age rather than on protecting users from developing gambling addiction. The online gambling platforms, operating with minimal regulatory oversight and with direct access to users' homes, have employed increasingly sophisticated psychological manipulation tactics to maximize gambling behavior. The targeting of online gambling marketing toward younger people represents a particularly troubling aspect of contemporary gambling expansion. Young people have grown up in digital environments and are generally comfortable with online technology. They are also at heightened risk for developing gambling addiction because the prefrontal cortex, the brain region involved in decision-making and impulse control, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. The combination of comfort with online technology and developmental vulnerability creates a situation where young people are particularly susceptible to the psychological manipulation employed by online gambling platforms. The aggressive marketing of online gambling to young people means that growing numbers of people are developing gambling addiction while still in their teenage years or early 20s. The integration of gambling elements into video games and other digital products has further blurred the line between entertainment and gambling, and has further expanded the accessibility of gambling to young people. Games that are marketed to young people increasingly incorporate mechanics that are essentially gambling mechanics, the random element of loot boxes that are purchased for real money and that contain randomly determined game items. The psychological mechanisms through which loot boxes encourage continued spending are very similar to the mechanisms through which slot machines encourage continued gambling. Yet, because loot boxes are incorporated into games rather than into standalone gambling platforms, they often escape the regulatory scrutiny applied to casinos and to online gambling platforms. The combination of online gambling, targeted algorithmic marketing, and the integration of gambling mechanics into entertainment products has created an environment where gambling has become far more accessible to far more people than at any point in history. The mathematical certainty that the gambling operators will profit on average remains unchanged. The odds still favor the operators, and the participants still statistically lose money on average. But the scale has changed dramatically. Millions of people now have access to gambling platforms that operate 24 hours a day and that employ sophisticated psychological manipulation to encourage gambling. The number of people developing gambling addiction has increased accordingly, and the amount of money being extracted from people through gambling has increased to unprecedented levels. The economic impact of the gambling industry has been extraordinary and has created peculiar effects on local economies and on state government finances. States that have legalized and promoted casino gambling have experienced significant revenues from gambling taxation. In some states, gambling revenue has become a substantial source of state revenue, in some cases accounting for 10% or more of state revenue. This has created situations where state governments have become dependent on gambling revenue and have strong financial incentives to promote gambling and to increase gambling accessibility and participation. The revenue from gambling has allowed some states to avoid raising income taxes or cutting other government services, creating a situation where the general population benefits financially from gambling, even though the benefits come at the cost of extracting wealth from a portion of the population that develops gambling addiction. The local economic effects of casino development have been mixed. Some casino communities have experienced economic revitalization. Areas that had been economically depressed have seen new construction, new employment, and increased tourist activity. But the long-term economic effects have often been disappointing compared to the short-term promises made during the casino development process. The employment created by casinos is often low-wage and has high turnover rates. The economic benefits generated by casino tourism often leak out of local communities because the casinos themselves are frequently owned by corporations that are not based in the local community and that extract profits for shareholders elsewhere. The long-term effect has often been that local communities have gained low-wage employment and infrastructure dedicated to gambling, while experiencing increases in problem gambling, increases in crime, and increases in social problems associated with gambling addiction. The impact of gambling addiction on family finances and on family relationships has been devastating for millions of people. Spouses and children of people with gambling addiction experience the consequences of financial devastation caused by gambling losses. Savings accumulated over years are gambled away. Mortgages and other debts are left unpaid. Families lose their homes. Children go without adequate nutrition or educational resources because family money has been gambled away. The psychological impact of living with a gambling-addicted family member is severe, with research documenting elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems in families of problem gamblers. The impact on children is particularly severe. Children who grow up in homes where a parent has a gambling addiction show elevated rates of behavioral problems, educational difficulties, and increased risk of developing their own gambling addiction or other addictions. The criminological impact of gambling addiction has been substantial. Problem gamblers resort to illegal activities to finance their gambling or to pay off debts accumulated through gambling. Theft, fraud, embezzlement, and other crimes are committed by people with gambling addiction trying to obtain money to gamble or to pay off debts. The criminal justice system becomes involved in addressing the consequences of gambling addiction. Problem gamblers are incarcerated for crimes committed to finance gambling, but the incarceration does nothing to address the underlying gambling addiction. Upon release, they are likely to return to gambling and to return to crime to finance gambling. The cycle perpetuates. The public health infrastructure in most jurisdictions is inadequate to address the scale of gambling addiction. Treatment programs exist, but are typically underfunded and have long waiting lists. The treatment that is available is often not effective. Many people complete treatment programs and return to gambling. The reasons for treatment failure are complex and involve both the strength of the addiction and the ongoing exposure to gambling opportunities and gambling marketing. Unlike alcohol or drug addiction, where the person can potentially avoid the substance entirely, gambling addiction involves exposure to gambling opportunities that are legal, that are actively promoted through marketing, and that are increasingly accessible through digital platforms. The disability and death caused by gambling addiction are documented but underappreciated in public discourse about gambling. Suicide rates among problem gamblers are elevated compared to the general population. Problem gamblers experience increased rates of depression and anxiety. The financial devastation caused by gambling addiction can result in loss of housing and loss of access to adequate food and medical care, with consequences for physical and mental health. The combination of psychological distress, financial devastation, and social isolation that characterizes advanced gambling addiction creates conditions where people experience suffering that is comparable to what people with severe substance addictions experience. The particular vulnerability of specific populations to gambling addiction deserves attention. Lower-income populations are disproportionately likely to develop gambling addiction, partly because state governments in lower-income areas have more aggressively promoted casino and lottery gambling as revenue sources, partly because lower-income people have fewer alternative sources of hope for financial improvement, and therefore may be more attracted to gambling as a potential path to wealth. Indigenous populations have been particularly vulnerable to gambling addiction on tribal lands where casinos have been established, with the combination of economic disadvantage, historical trauma, and geographic isolation from addiction treatment creating elevated rates of gambling addiction. The targeting of marketing toward these populations, combined with the higher accessibility of gambling in their communities, has resulted in disproportionate impacts of gambling addiction on already vulnerable populations. The role of the lottery in the gambling ecosystem deserves examination. Lotteries are operated by state governments ostensibly to generate revenue for public purposes like education or infrastructure. But lotteries operate according to the same basic principle as casinos and casino games. They extract money from participants through games that are structured so that the participants lose money on average. The house edge in lotteries is often higher than in casinos. In many lotteries, the state retains 30–40% of revenues, leaving only 50–60% for payouts to winners. This means that the expected value of a lottery ticket is extraordinarily negative. Yet state governments aggressively market lotteries and make lottery participation easy and accessible. The combination of state government promotion and the accessibility of lottery participation has made the lottery one of the primary mechanisms through which money is extracted from lower-income populations and transferred to state governments and to casino corporations. The intersection of gambling with other forms of addiction and mental illness creates particularly severe consequences for individuals who develop multiple simultaneous addictions or who have both gambling addiction and other mental health conditions. Research has documented elevated rates of substance use disorders among people with gambling addiction. The same psychological mechanisms that make a person vulnerable to gambling addiction, difficulty with impulse control, sensation-seeking behavior, difficulty tolerating negative emotions, make a person vulnerable to substance addiction. People with both gambling and substance addictions face particularly severe consequences, including rapid financial devastation, accelerated progression of both addictions, and elevated suicide risk. The intersection of gambling with mental illness is equally important. Gambling addiction frequently co-occurs with depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and other mental health conditions. The relationship between these conditions and gambling is bidirectional. Gambling addiction contributes to the development of depression and anxiety through the financial devastation and social isolation that it causes. And depression and anxiety increase vulnerability to developing gambling addiction by making the psychological escape that gambling provides more appealing. The treatment of people with both gambling addiction and mental illness requires integrated approaches addressing both conditions simultaneously. But most treatment systems have not developed the integration necessary to effectively address both problems. The role of cognitive distortions in maintaining gambling addiction deserves detailed attention because these distortions are deliberately cultivated by gambling operators. The gambler's fallacy, the belief that past losses increase the probability of future wins, keeps people gambling in hope that they will eventually recoup their losses. The illusion of control, the belief that they can influence games of chance, keeps people convinced that they can win if they just find the right strategy or the right approach. The belief in lucky numbers or in hot or cold streak, despite the fact that these concepts have no mathematical basis, keeps people gambling in hope that they have identified a pattern that will allow them to win. All of these cognitive distortions are reinforced by casino design, by the presentation of games, and by the marketing of gambling. The deliberate cultivation of these cognitive distortions by gambling operators raises serious ethical questions. The operators know that these distortions are false. They know that the gambler's fallacy has no basis in probability. They know that the illusion of control is an illusion. They know that lucky numbers have no effect on random game outcomes. Yet they deliberately create environments and games that encourage and reinforce these distortions. This represents a form of systematic manipulation where operators are deliberately encouraging false beliefs that lead people to gamble in ways that are contrary to their own financial interests. The history of gambling fraud and cheating provides context for understanding the ethics of the gambling industry. Throughout history, people operating gambling games have cheated whenever they believed they could do so without being caught. Dealers have manipulated cards, roulette wheels have been biased, dice have been weighted. The extent of cheating in casinos has been substantial enough that regulatory agencies have had to establish sophisticated surveillance and enforcement mechanisms to detect and prevent cheating. But the existence of cheating raises a question. If operators engage in deliberate fraud to increase their advantage beyond the mathematical house edge, what does that say about the ethics of the entire industry? The answer appears to be that the gambling industry views cheating as a violation of the rules, not as a violation of ethics. The ethics of extracting money from people through mathematical manipulation and psychological exploitation is apparently not questioned, but the ethics of extracting money through fraud beyond what is mathematized and officially acknowledged is grounds for criminal prosecution. This moral distinction is extraordinarily revealing about the character of the gambling industry. The industry draws a line between legitimate mathematical extraction of wealth through games with house edges and illegitimate extraction of wealth through fraud and cheating. But from the perspective of the person gambling, the distinction may be meaningless. Whether they lose money because of a mathematical house edge or because of cheating, they have lost money. Whether they were manipulated through game design or through fraud, they were manipulated. The drawing of a line between acceptable and unacceptable forms of wealth extraction reveals more about legal distinctions than about moral distinctions. The development of technology for detecting and preventing cheating in casinos has been substantial. Modern casinos employ surveillance systems that record all gaming activities. They employ mathematics and statisticians to detect unusual patterns in game outcomes that might indicate cheating. They employ security personnel who are trained to identify cheating techniques. The investment in preventing cheating is enormous. Yet this massive investment in preventing cheating exists alongside the complete acceptance of the legitimate mathematical extraction of wealth through house edges and psychological manipulation. The resources devoted to preventing cheating would dwarf the resources devoted to preventing gambling addiction or to addressing the harms caused by gambling addiction. The distinction between professional gambling and casual gambling reveals further complications in how society views gambling. Professional card players who play poker with house edges close to zero, and who make their living based on superior skill and judgment, are generally viewed more favorably than people who gamble in games like roulette where pure chance determines outcomes. The implication is that gambling is acceptable if the person has skill and can influence outcomes, but less acceptable if the person is purely relying on chance. Yet this distinction obscures the reality that even in skill-based gambling, the house edge typically ensures that the operator profits and that the participants lose money on average. The focus on whether a person is skilled enough to potentially overcome the house edge obscures the reality that for the vast majority of people, gambling results in financial loss. The contemporary state of the gambling industry in 2025 represents an enormously complex landscape where casino gambling, online gambling, sports betting, and lotteries have become normalized components of consumer culture, and where government revenues have become dependent on gambling. The gambling industry generates hundreds of billions of dollars in annual revenue globally. The industry employs hundreds of thousands of people. The industry has political influence that allows it to shape regulation and policy. The industry has become integrated into entertainment, into sports, into popular culture. Young people grow up in an environment where gambling is constantly presented as a normal activity and where gambling messaging is ubiquitous. The integration of sports betting into mainstream culture represents a particularly recent and significant development. Historically, sports betting was largely illegal and was operated by criminal organizations. But as state governments have legalized sports betting, the activity has been rapidly normalized. Professional sports leagues that once opposed sports betting now actively promote sports betting partnerships. Television broadcasts of sporting events now include betting lines and gambling promotions. The integration of gambling into sports has created situations where viewing sports essentially requires engagement with gambling content. Young people watching sporting events are exposed to gambling marketing and are encouraged to place bets. The expansion of gambling into sports betting represents a concerning development because sports betting is genuinely difficult to distinguish from the sport itself when the sport is presented alongside betting information and gambling promotion. A person watching a football game is not necessarily aware that they are being exposed to gambling marketing. The betting lines and the commentary about betting are presented as information about the sport rather than as marketing for gambling. This integration of gambling into the core experience of consuming sports means that gambling has achieved a level of cultural normalization and accessibility that seems difficult to reverse. The impact of widespread gambling accessibility on public health and on mental health treatment systems is substantial. Emergency rooms in areas with significant casino gambling and online gambling accessibility report elevated presentations of people experiencing acute gambling crisis, people who have gambled away critical resources, and are experiencing severe financial distress and psychological crisis. Mental health treatment systems report increasing numbers of people with gambling addiction seeking treatment. Suicide hotlines report calls from people with gambling addiction who are suicidal as a result of financial devastation caused by gambling. The public health systems have not been adequately resourced to address these consequences of normalized gambling. The specific mechanisms through which online gambling platforms exploit psychological vulnerabilities have become increasingly sophisticated. The platforms employ machine learning algorithms to identify which promotional messages, which game variations, which timing of notifications would be most likely to encourage each individual user to gamble. The platforms send personalized notifications designed to encourage gambling, notifications about special promotions timed for when the user is statistically likely to gamble, notifications designed to appeal to the user's specific psychological vulnerabilities. The platforms create a continuous stream of content designed to keep gambling salient in the user's mind and to encourage frequent gambling. The use of push notifications to encourage gambling represents a particularly troubling aspect of online gambling. Unlike a physical casino where a person has to consciously decide to go to the casino, online gambling platforms bring the casino directly to the person's phone or computer. The platforms send notifications that are designed to trigger gambling behavior. A notification might inform the user about a special promotion, or might congratulate them on their status in a loyalty program, or might simply ask, "Haven't you missed us?" Studies have shown that these notifications significantly increase gambling behavior and that the frequency of notifications correlates with the amount of money people gamble. The personalization of the gambling experience based on individual user data represents another level of psychological sophistication. The platforms track which games the user plays most frequently, which games result in the most betting, which promotional messages the user responds to. They use this information to customize the experience to maximize the amount the individual user gambles. A user who is particularly susceptible to the excitement of near-miss events in slot machine-style games will see those games featured prominently. A user who is particularly responsive to announcements of special promotions will receive frequent promotional notifications. A user who shows signs of being in danger of developing problem gambling might see their spending limits increased rather than decreased, because allowing them to spend more money is in the financial interest of the platform. The targeting of vulnerable populations through online gambling platforms has been substantial. The platforms use data analysis to identify individuals who show signs of problem gambling, and then target those individuals with promotional messages and with features designed to encourage further gambling. A person who has shown signs of problematic gambling might receive offers for increased deposit limits or special promotions designed to appeal to them. Rather than using data about problematic gambling to limit gambling, the platforms use data about problematic gambling to target users more effectively. This represents an extraordinary inversion of harm prevention logic, where companies actively target their most vulnerable customers for more intensive exploitation. The global expansion of gambling through online platforms has resulted in the accessibility of gambling to populations that previously had limited access to casinos. A person in a country where casino gambling is prohibited can nevertheless access online gambling platforms based in other jurisdictions. The platforms operate across national boundaries and have little regulatory oversight in many jurisdictions. The combination of global accessibility and minimal regulation has created an environment where gambling is more accessible than at any point in history, and where the mechanisms for extraction of wealth have become more sophisticated than at any point in history. The question of whether gambling should be prohibited entirely or whether it should be regulated to minimize harm has been a recurring theme throughout the history of gambling policy. Different societies have taken different approaches. Some jurisdictions have prohibited gambling entirely. Others have established careful regulatory frameworks. Others have deregulated gambling extensively. The evidence regarding which approach produces the best outcomes is not entirely clear, but some patterns have emerged. Jurisdictions that have prohibited gambling entirely have found that prohibition is difficult to enforce and that black markets develop. Jurisdictions that have established careful regulatory frameworks with strong consumer protection provisions have shown lower rates of problem gambling than jurisdictions with minimal regulation. But even jurisdictions with strong regulatory frameworks have seen increases in problem gambling as gambling has become more accessible and as marketing has become more sophisticated. The regulatory frameworks that have been most effective in reducing problem gambling share certain characteristics. They limit the accessibility of gambling through geographic and temporal restrictions. They impose age restrictions and enforce those restrictions effectively. They require casinos and gambling operators to fund treatment programs at levels proportional to the revenue generated by gambling. They impose meaningful restrictions on gambling marketing and advertising. They require operators to implement self-exclusion programs that allow people to exclude themselves from gambling for specified periods. They impose limits on the speed of play and on the time periods during which gambling is available. They require clear disclosure of odds and house edges. They establish accessible complaint mechanisms for people who believe they have been treated unfairly. They employ a regulatory agency with adequate resources and independence from industry influence. No jurisdiction in the United States or in most other countries implements all of these protective measures. Most jurisdictions implement some of these measures but fall short on others. Some jurisdictions fail to adequately fund treatment programs. Some jurisdictions have weak restrictions on marketing. Some jurisdictions have inadequate regulation of online gambling. The result is that gambling continues to expand and to extract wealth from vulnerable populations despite the existence of evidence regarding which regulatory approaches would be more protective. The role of harm reduction in gambling policy is worth examining. The harm reduction approach to gambling addiction would involve accepting that some people will gamble and that some people will develop gambling addiction, and focusing on reducing the harms that result from gambling rather than attempting to prevent gambling entirely. This approach might include things like mandatory deposit limits. Players could only deposit a certain amount of money per day or per week. It might include mandatory timeout mechanisms. Players would be required to take breaks from gambling at certain intervals. It might include mandatory display of odds and probability of outcomes in comprehensible formats. It might include a requirement that operators track and warn users if they appear to be developing problematic gambling patterns. Some of these harm reduction approaches have been implemented on limited bases in some jurisdictions, but they remain the exception rather than the rule. Most gambling operations resist implementing meaningful harm reduction measures because such measures would reduce the amount of money that people gamble and would therefore reduce operators' revenues. The financial incentives of the operators are aligned with maximizing gambling and with extracting maximum wealth from users, not with reducing the harms caused by gambling. This creates a fundamental conflict between the financial interests of gambling operators and the public health interests in reducing gambling addiction. The evidence that gambling operators actively resist harm reduction measures is substantial. When regulators have proposed mandatory deposit limits or timeout mechanisms, gambling operators have lobbied against those proposals. When jurisdictions have required stronger disclosure of odds and probabilities, gambling operators have argued that such disclosures are not necessary. When researchers have suggested that the design of games should be modified to reduce the addictiveness of games, gambling operators have argued that such modifications would reduce player enjoyment and would be unnecessary. The resistance of operators to harm reduction measures reveals that they recognize such measures would reduce the amount of money people gamble and would reduce their profits. The public health approach to gambling would frame gambling addiction as a public health problem requiring coordinated intervention across multiple systems including healthcare, criminal justice, education, and social services. Such an approach would involve public funding for prevention, treatment, and research. Such an approach would involve regulation of gambling operations to minimize harms. Such an approach would involve integration of gambling addiction treatment into mainstream healthcare. Such an approach would involve public education about the risks of gambling. Most jurisdictions have not adopted a comprehensive public health approach to gambling. Instead, gambling policy has been driven primarily by the desire of state governments to generate revenue from gambling and by the lobbying power of the gambling industry. The potential for prohibition of gambling represents an option that has not been seriously considered in most jurisdictions, but that deserves examination. Prohibition of recreational gambling would eliminate the direct extraction of money from people through games of chance. This would prevent the development of gambling addiction in the first place, rather than trying to treat gambling addiction after it develops. Prohibition would eliminate the governmental revenue from gambling, which would require alternative sources of revenue or reduction in spending. Prohibition would create black markets where unregulated gambling would continue to occur. But prohibition would nevertheless represent a decisive public health choice to not permit an industry whose fundamental purpose is to exploit psychological vulnerabilities and to extract wealth from people through games that are mathematically guaranteed to result in losses for participants. The contemporary status quo in which gambling is simultaneously condemned as a public health problem and actively promoted as a source of government revenue represents a fundamental moral contradiction. State governments take tax money from people and use it to educate them about the dangers of gambling addiction. then those same state governments actively promote gambling and use gambling revenue as a source of government funding. The contradiction is resolved by separating the public health domain from the revenue domain, treating gambling addiction as a health problem while treating gambling revenue as an unrelated policy domain. But this separation is false. The gambling revenue depends on people gambling. The more people gamble and the more people develop gambling addiction, the more revenue the state generates. The specific design features of contemporary gambling games and platforms reveal how thoroughly the industry has integrated scientific understanding of human psychology into the purpose of maximizing the extraction of wealth. The slot machines of contemporary casinos are not simple games of chance where a wheel spins and lands on a random result. They are sophisticated computer systems programmed to deliver specific psychological experiences designed to maintain engagement and to encourage continued gambling. The machines are programmed to deliver near-miss events at specific frequencies, typically much higher than would occur by chance, because research has shown that near-miss events produce heightened arousal and increased motivation to continue gambling. The machines are programmed to deliver occasional large wins that exceed the amount wagered, creating the psychological experience of winning, even though the person may have lost money on average over their gambling session. The machines employ sound and light presentations that are scientifically designed to trigger dopamine release in the brain, creating the same neurochemical reward response that would be triggered by naturally reinforcing activities or by drugs of abuse. The machines are programmed to accelerate the pace of play in ways that prevent the person from accurately assessing how much money they have lost. The machines use sophisticated animation and graphics that create the illusion of control and the illusion that the outcomes are based on skill rather than on chance. The design of online gambling platforms represents an even more sophisticated application of psychological manipulation, because the platforms can adapt in real time based on the behavior of individual users. A platform can monitor how a user responds to specific features or to specific messaging, and can adjust the presentation of those features in real time to maximize the user's engagement. A user who appears to be losing interest in a particular game might be presented with variations of that game designed to re-engage them. A user who appears to be considering stopping gambling might be presented with a special promotional offer. The personalization of the experience based on individual behavior represents psychological manipulation at a level that has no historical precedent. The integration of social elements into gambling platforms has further increased the addictiveness of gambling. Online gambling platforms have incorporated features that allow users to share their wins with other users, to compete with other users, and to form communities around gambling. These social features create psychological bonds with the platforms and with other users that increase the likelihood that people will continue using the platforms and continue gambling. The social aspects of gambling can create a sense of belonging and of community that is particularly appealing to people who are socially isolated or who have experienced social rejection in other contexts. The use of seasonal or event-based promotions has been employed by gambling platforms to create artificial increases in motivation to gamble at specific times. A promotion tied to a sporting event, a holiday, or some other external event creates a sense of urgency to gamble before the promotion ends. This taps into the psychological principle of scarcity, the belief that limited availability items are more valuable and more desirable. The use of such promotions creates cycles of increased gambling that correspond to specific external events rather than to the user's natural motivation to gamble. The role of loss aversion in gambling psychology deserves attention. Research in behavioral economics has shown that people are more motivated to avoid losses than they are to achieve equivalent gains. A person who has lost $100 is more motivated to continue gambling in hope of recovering the losses than they would be motivated to gamble if they were trying to win $100 from scratch. The gambling industry has integrated this understanding into the design of promotions and into the framing of gambling experiences. Promotions might emphasize the potential to recover recent losses rather than emphasizing the potential to win new money. This taps into the loss aversion bias to increase motivation to gamble. The phenomenon of chasing losses represents one of the most destructive aspects of gambling addiction. A person who has lost money gambling often experiences a strong motivation to continue gambling in hope of recovering the losses. This motivation can be so strong that it overrides rational judgment about the amount of money being lost, and about the impact of losses on financial well-being. The chasing of losses frequently results in escalation of gambling and in more severe financial devastation than would have occurred if the person had stopped gambling after the initial losses. The gambling industry deliberately structures promotions and rewards to encourage the chasing of losses. A person who loses money might receive an offer for a loss rebate, a payment of a percentage of their losses back to them, which simultaneously acknowledges the loss and provides incentive to continue gambling in hope of recovering the losses and of earning additional rebates. The specific targeting of different populations through different features and different marketing messages represents another sophisticated aspect of contemporary gambling. A platform might present a younger audience with games that emphasize speed and competition. A platform might present an older audience with games that evoke nostalgia or with games that are familiar from earlier periods of life. A platform might target lower-income users with promotions that emphasize the potential for life-changing wins and that position gambling as a path to wealth. The personalization of marketing based on demographic and behavioral characteristics represents an effort to identify which messages and which game features would be most likely to encourage each particular audience segment to gamble more. The path of gambling throughout human history, and particularly through the expansion of gambling in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, reveals a consistent pattern where activities that are primarily designed to extract wealth from people through exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities become normalized and become integrated into mainstream culture and into government policy. The pattern is similar to the patterns observed in the pharmaceutical industry and in the methamphetamine epidemic. An activity that has serious harms becomes legitimate through legalization, becomes promoted through marketing, becomes defended through claims of personal freedom and responsible consumption, and becomes institutionalized through government involvement and dependence on revenues generated by the activity. The normalization of gambling has reached extraordinary levels in contemporary culture. Gambling is referenced in entertainment media. Professional sports incorporate gambling promotions. Young people are exposed to gambling marketing. Online gambling platforms are accessible through smartphones that young people carry constantly. The cultural message is that gambling is a normal, respectable activity that is available to people of all ages, and that represents entertainment and potential wealth generation rather than an activity designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities and to extract wealth from people. This normalization has occurred despite clear evidence that gambling causes serious harms including gambling addiction, financial devastation, loss of relationships, loss of employment, mental health problems including depression and suicidality, and family disruption. The evidence about the harms of gambling has not prevented the expansion of gambling. Instead, the evidence has been compartmentalized, acknowledged in public health contexts while being ignored in revenue and policy contexts. States acknowledge that gambling causes problems, fund minimal treatment programs, and simultaneously aggressively promote gambling as a revenue source. The role of marketing in the normalization of gambling deserves continued attention. The gambling industry has become extraordinarily sophisticated in its marketing approaches. The marketing emphasizes entertainment value and the excitement of gambling while downplaying or ignoring the mathematical certainty that people will lose money on average. The marketing emphasizes the stories of people who have won large amounts rather than the far more common stories of people who have lost money. The marketing has integrated itself into entertainment and sports in ways that make gambling seem like a normal component of consuming entertainment rather than like a separate and distinct activity. The specific mechanisms through which gambling marketing has become integrated into entertainment reveal how thoroughly the gambling industry has penetrated popular culture. A person watching a sporting event cannot avoid exposure to gambling messaging. During breaks in the action, there are advertisements for gambling platforms. The commentators discuss betting lines and encourage viewers to place bets. The broadcasts present betting information as a normal component of the sporting event. A young person growing up in contemporary culture is exposed to gambling messaging constantly through television, through social media, through gaming platforms, and through other digital channels. The role of celebrity endorsements in gambling marketing has been substantial. Professional athletes, actors, and other celebrities have been employed to endorse gambling platforms and to encourage people to gamble. These endorsements create the impression that gambling is endorsed by people of high status and that gambling is a desirable activity. The use of celebrities who are known to be trusted and likable by their audiences represents a particularly effective form of marketing because the endorsement comes from a source that the audience already trusts and likes. The integration of gambling into gaming platforms designed for young people represents another particularly troubling aspect of contemporary gambling expansion. Games designed for young people increasingly incorporate gacha mechanics where players spend real money to open loot boxes containing random game items. These mechanics are essentially gambling. Players spend money for a chance at valuable items, with the outcome determined by randomness rather than by skill or by the amount of money spent. The psychological mechanisms through which gacha mechanics encourage continued spending are essentially identical to the mechanisms through which slot machines encourage continued gambling. Yet because these mechanics are incorporated into games rather than into standalone gambling platforms, they often escape the regulatory scrutiny applied to casinos. The lack of clear age restrictions for access to gambling through online platforms represents a fundamental regulatory failure. While casinos and other regulated gambling establishments have age restrictions and generally enforce them, online gambling platforms operate with minimal age verification. A young person can access online gambling platforms using a parent's credit card or payment account. The platforms have no reliable mechanism for verifying the age of users. This means that people who are not even legally permitted to gamble in casinos can nevertheless gamble through online platforms. The targeting of young people through gaming and gambling integration is not accidental. The gambling industry recognizes that people who begin gambling when young are likely to develop more severe gambling addictions and are likely to gamble more money over their lifetime. The integration of gambling mechanics into games that are popular among young people represents an attempt to introduce young people to gambling while their developing brains are particularly vulnerable to addiction. The behavioral patterns established during adolescence and early adulthood are likely to persist throughout life. Someone who develops a habit of regular gambling during their teenage years is likely to continue gambling regularly throughout adulthood. This makes the targeting of young people particularly valuable from the perspective of the gambling industry. The contemporary state of gambling in 2025 represents a moment in which gambling has become more accessible, more normalized, and more sophisticated in its psychological manipulation than at any point in human history. The industry that was once dominated by organized crime and was largely relegated to specific geographic locations has evolved into a global industry that operates across borders and that reaches into people's homes through digital devices. The mathematical certainty that operators will profit and that participants will lose money on average has not changed. The psychological vulnerabilities that make gambling appealing have not fundamentally changed, but the sophistication of the mechanisms designed to exploit those vulnerabilities has increased dramatically. The accessibility of gambling has increased dramatically. The social and cultural acceptance of gambling has increased dramatically. The integration of gambling into other activities like sports and gaming has increased dramatically. The result is that gambling has become one of the most effective mechanisms ever developed for extracting wealth from people, particularly from vulnerable populations including lower-income people, young people, and people with psychological vulnerabilities or mental illness. The gambling industry generates hundreds of billions of dollars in annual revenue globally. The industry has enormous political influence that shapes regulation and policy. The industry has successfully positioned itself as a provider of entertainment and as a legitimate form of economic activity rather than as what it fundamentally is, a mechanism for extracting wealth from people through exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities. The question of what society should do about gambling is not a simple question with a clear answer. A complete prohibition of gambling would eliminate the direct extraction of wealth from people through gambling, but would create black markets and would be difficult to enforce. A system of heavy regulation with strong consumer protection provisions would reduce some harms, but would likely not prevent the continuation of gambling by people with severe gambling addiction. A public health approach to gambling would involve investment in prevention, treatment, and research at levels comparable to the investment in addressing other major public health problems. But this would require political will to substantially alter current policy and to reduce the revenue that states derive from gambling. What is clear is that the current situation in which gambling is simultaneously condemned as a public health problem and actively promoted as a revenue source is not sustainable. The contradiction at the heart of this approach means that gambling continues to expand, that the harms continue to increase, and that public health systems are overwhelmed trying to address harms that government policy is simultaneously creating. The expansion of online gambling and the integration of gambling into other activities means that gambling is becoming increasingly difficult to avoid or to regulate effectively. The sophistication of psychological manipulation employed by gambling platforms means that addiction is becoming increasingly likely and increasingly severe. The historical trajectory of gambling suggests that without significant intervention, gambling will continue to expand and will continue to become more integrated into mainstream culture and into government policy. The pharmaceutical industry's pattern of creating addiction, resisting regulation, and eventually achieving victory through the integration of their products into government policy provides a template that the gambling industry is following. Like pharmaceutical companies, the gambling industry develops products that are designed to create and perpetuate addiction. Like pharmaceutical companies, the gambling industry resists regulation and employs extensive marketing to promote their products. Like pharmaceutical companies, the gambling industry has achieved integration into government policy such that government revenues depend on the addiction that the industry creates. The recognition of gambling as a systematic form of wealth extraction designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities suggests that society should be making very different policy choices about gambling than the choices that are currently being made. A society committed to the welfare of its citizens would not be in the business of operating or promoting an industry whose fundamental purpose is to exploit psychological vulnerabilities and to extract wealth from people. A society committed to the welfare of its citizens would recognize that the revenue derived from gambling comes at the cost of financial devastation and mental health consequences for the people from whom the revenue is extracted. A society committed to the welfare of its citizens would be willing to forego the revenue from gambling in order to protect people from the harms caused by gambling. The fact that no wealthy democracy has made this choice reveals something fundamental about how contemporary democratic societies prioritize revenue generation and economic growth over the welfare of their citizens. The fact that governments actively promote gambling, even as they acknowledge its harms, reveals the subordination of health concerns to financial concerns. The fact that the gambling industry successfully resists regulation and successfully promotes expansion despite clear evidence of serious harms reveals the political power that economic interests can exercise over public policy. The story of gambling is ultimately a story about human psychological vulnerabilities and about how institutions can be organized to systematically exploit those vulnerabilities. It is a story that parallels the stories of pharmaceutical addiction, of drug epidemics, and of other mechanisms through which wealth is extracted from vulnerable populations. It is a story about how activities that cause serious harm can become normalized through legalization, through marketing, through integration into mainstream culture, and through government involvement and dependence on revenues generated by the activity. It is a story that demonstrates the power of economic interests to shape policy and to overcome evidence of harms in pursuit of profit. The path forward from the current situation, involving ubiquitous gambling and escalating gambling addiction, would require society to make a choice about whether it values the welfare of its citizens more than it values the revenue generated by extracting wealth from people through gambling. That choice has not been made in most jurisdictions. The choice that has been made is to expand gambling, to normalize gambling, to aggressively market gambling, and to depend on revenue from gambling. The consequences of that choice are measured in financial devastation, in family disruption, in mental health problems, and in deaths from gambling-related suicide. In 2025, gambling is more accessible and more normalized than at any point in history. The mathematical certainty that the house always wins remains unchanged. The psychological vulnerabilities that make gambling appealing remain unchanged. The mechanisms for exploiting those vulnerabilities have become far more sophisticated. The scope of the gambling industry has expanded to unprecedented levels. And the harms caused by gambling continue to accumulate without adequate response or without meaningful intervention to prevent the expansion or to address the underlying causes. This is the story of gambling, A story that extends from ancient games played in marketplaces through the mob-controlled casinos of Las Vegas to the algorithmic manipulation of contemporary online gambling platforms. It is a story about human desire for wealth and for excitement, about the design of systems to exploit that desire, and about the choices that societies make about whether to protect their citizens from exploitation or whether to participate in and profit from that exploitation. The story continues to unfold, with each new technological advancement bringing new mechanisms for psychological manipulation, and with each expansion of gambling access bringing new populations into gambling and into the risk of gambling addiction. Until the underlying incentive structures change, until governments choose not to profit from gambling, until the gambling industry's license to operate is reconsidered, until society prioritizes the welfare of citizens over revenue generation, the story will continue on its current trajectory toward increased gambling, increased addiction, and increased human suffering.